Zodiac Killer, The Letters That Terrorized California, Episode 16. Northern California at the end of the 1960s was a place caught between two different moods. On the surface, life looked bright. The optimism of the decade still lingered in the air. Young people drove along empty roads at night with the windows down. Small towns felt quiet and familiar. Couples parked in secluded places believing privacy and distance offered a kind of safety. But beneath that calm, something darker was beginning to take shape. Not all fear arrives loudly. Sometimes it enters a community in fragments. A strange murder on a lonely road. A second attack with no clear suspect. A voice on a telephone line. A letter sent through the mail. At first, none of it looks large enough to become history. Then the pattern begins. Then the name appears. And once that happens, ordinary violence becomes something else entirely. The first known attack connected to the Zodiac case happened on December 20, 1968, near Vallejo, California. David Faraday was 17 years old. Betty Lou Jensen was 16. They were young, close to Christmas, and doing something so ordinary it barely deserved a second thought. They had parked on a quiet stretch of road known locally as a lover's lane, the kind of place teenagers had been using for years when they wanted to be alone for a little while before going home. It was cold that night. The road was dark. The area isolated. Nothing about it suggested that history was waiting there. At some point, another vehicle arrived. What happened in the next few minutes was never fully witnessed by anyone who could explain it cleanly from beginning to end. But the physical scene told enough of the story to leave investigators deeply uneasy. David Faraday was shot at close range. Betty Lou Jensen got out of the car and ran. She did not get far. The killer fired multiple times into her back as she fled into the darkness. Both teenagers died on that road. When police arrived, they faced the kind of case that always begins with uncertainty. There were no immediate witnesses who could identify the attacker. No obvious robbery. No clear sign of personal motive. The victims were young, with no known connection to anyone who would want them dead in such a calculated way. At first, detectives considered the possibilities that detectives always consider. A jealous rival. A personal conflict. Someone the victims knew. Someone who had followed them. But the scene resisted easy explanation. There was too little to hold on to. Too many questions. Not enough shape. And when a crime has no shape, fear stays local at first. It belongs only to the families, the investigators, and the small number of people who cannot stop replaying the details in their minds. That was how the first attack entered the world. Quietly. As a terrible crime. Not yet as a legend. Months passed. The case remained open, but it did not expand in the public imagination the way later events would. There was no name attached to it. No clear suspect moving through newspaper headlines. No symbol for people to recognize. Just a double murder on a dark road and the uncomfortable feeling that whoever had done it had vanished completely. Then came July 4, 1969. Blue Rock Springs Park. Another young couple parked in a car at night. Darlene Farron was 22 years old. Michael Mageau was 19. The scene was different, but only on the surface. Once again, the setting was private in the way parked cars often feel private. The rest of the world is outside the windows. The doors are closed. The night seems distant. People believe, for a few minutes, that they are inside their own sealed space. That illusion mattered. Because the man who approached them understood exactly how fragile it was. A car pulled in behind them. Then it drove away. Then it returned. That detail would stay with investigators later because it suggested thought. Observation. Choice. The attacker was not simply passing through. He was deciding something. A man stepped out carrying a flashlight. For a moment, the light made him seem official. Michael Mageau would later say he thought it might be a police officer approaching the car. That instinct was understandable. Flashlight first. Sudden authority. A figure appearing from darkness with the confidence of someone who expected obedience. Then the gunfire started. The weapon was a 9mm pistol. Michael was hit. Darlene was hit. The attacker turned and walked away. Then, in one of the coldest details in the entire case, he returned to the car and fired again. That second approach mattered. It suggested control. Not frenzy. Not panic. A deliberate decision to make sure the damage was complete. Darlene Ferrin died from her injuries. Michael Mageau survived. And because he survived, the case gained something it did not have after the first attack. A witness. He could not give police everything they wanted. Trauma never works that neatly. But he could describe enough to deepen the sense that the shooter was calm, methodical, and frighteningly composed. Then, less than an hour later, the case changed again. A phone rang at the Vallejo Police Department. The call came from a public payphone only a short distance away. On the other end was a male voice. He spoke plainly. He reported the shooting at Blue Rock Springs. Then he added something else. He said he had also killed the 2 teenagers the previous year. After that, he hung up. No dramatic speech. No anger. No panic. Just a voice delivering information and disappearing into silence. For detectives, that phone call did more than connect 2 crimes. It announced a mind. The killer was not only acting. He was inserting himself into the investigation. He wanted the police to know there was a link. He wanted them to understand that the violence was not random in the ordinary sense. There was one man behind it. One will. One consciousness moving between scenes and then stepping forward just enough to be noticed. That desire to be noticed would become one of the defining features of the entire case. But it still had not reached its full form. That came later that month. In August, letters began arriving at newspapers. 3 nearly identical letters were mailed to different publications in Northern California. Each contained a confession. Each claimed responsibility for the killings. Each included details that had not been publicly released, details that strongly suggested the writer was telling the truth. The letters did not read like ordinary confessions. They read like performances. The writer demanded that the newspapers print a coded message on their front pages. If they refused, he threatened to kill again. The cipher itself was made up of strange symbols and letters arranged like a puzzle. It came with the clear implication that the person behind the murders was not satisfied with remaining invisible. He wanted attention, obedience, and control. And at the bottom of the letters was a symbol. A circle crossed by vertical and horizontal lines. It looked simple. Almost abstract. But once printed, it became unforgettable. Soon after, another letter arrived. This time, the writer gave himself a name. Zodiac. That was the moment the case crossed the line. Before then, police were dealing with a killer. Now they were dealing with a killer who had become a public identity. That change matters more than people sometimes realize. Once a murderer names himself, he begins trying to shape the story. He is no longer content with leaving bodies and disappearing. He wants to direct the fear. He wants to influence the rhythm of the investigation, the headlines, the conversations at dinner tables, the imagination of people who have never met him and never will. The Zodiac understood that instinctively. His violence was only part of the weapon. The rest was communication. The letters spread fear in a different way than the shootings had. A shooting is immediate. It shocks a town, devastates families, terrifies the people who can imagine themselves in the same place. But a letter travels farther. It moves through newspapers, through police departments, through homes, through the wider public. It allows a killer to enter rooms he has never physically been inside. That is exactly what Zodiac was doing. He was turning murder into correspondence. He was turning investigation into theater. And California was beginning to understand that this was not going to end quickly. The cipher fascinated the public almost immediately. Amateur codebreakers, teachers, couples, entire families began trying to solve it. Eventually, part of it was deciphered by a schoolteacher and his wife. The message did not reveal the killer's name as he had suggested. Instead, it revealed something arguably more disturbing. It spoke about killing as pleasure. It described murder as a form of collection, as if the victims were being gathered for some purpose beyond death itself. The message was grotesque, theatrical, and self-mythologizing. But investigators paid attention to it because beneath the strange wording was a simple truth. The killer was telling them something about how he wanted to be seen. Not as a man with a gun. As something larger. Something beyond ordinary motive. Something that could not be understood using ordinary logic. That was part of the strategy. The more alien he seemed, the more powerful he became in the public imagination. And yet, for all the symbolism and mystery, the facts remained brutally human. 2 attacks. 4 victims. 2 dead teenage lovers on a lonely road. A young woman dead in a parked car. A young man left alive to remember the light, the gunfire, and the silhouette of the man who stepped out of the darkness as if he belonged there. Investigators now had more than they had at the start. They had ballistic evidence. They had a survivor. They had letters. They had a symbol. They had a name. What they still did not have was the person behind any of it. And that absence was beginning to change the atmosphere across Northern California. People read the letters and began imagining him everywhere. On quiet roads. In parked cars. At gas stations late at night. Watching from another vehicle. Listening to the radio reports about himself. Following the newspapers to see whether his demands had been obeyed. That is what cases like this do when they start to expand. The suspect stops being a person and becomes a possibility. He could be anywhere because no one knows where he is. He could be ordinary because no one has yet proven otherwise. The myth grows fastest in that gap. For Zodiac, the gap was becoming the perfect hiding place. And the most dangerous part was that he seemed to enjoy every second of it. By the end of the summer of 1969, the Zodiac had already done something most killers never managed to do. He had made people afraid not only of what he had done, but of what he might do next. That difference is important. Fear based on the past has limits. People look at a crime scene, shake their heads, lock their doors a little earlier, and tell themselves the worst has already happened there. But fear based on anticipation spreads differently. It moves ahead of events. It settles into ordinary routines. It makes people scan empty roads more carefully. It makes every unknown car feel like a question. The Zodiac was learning how to create that kind of fear. He was not simply attacking people. He was shaping expectation. And then, on September 27, 1969, he struck again. This time the setting was Lake Berryessa. Unlike the earlier attacks, which happened around parked cars at night, this one unfolded in daylight. That alone made it more unsettling. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were spending the afternoon near the lake. It was quiet there, the kind of peaceful California landscape that seems untouched by the noise of the world. They were relaxing on a blanket near the shoreline, talking, enjoying a Saturday that should have faded into memory like any other. Then they saw a man approaching. At first, there was something strange about the way he looked. He was not rushing. He was not hiding. He moved with the same unsettling calm that had appeared in earlier parts of the case, but this time there was something more. He was wearing an executioner-style hood. The black hood covered his head completely. Over the chest area was the now familiar symbol of the Zodiac, the cross-circle emblem that had already appeared in his letters. The sight of it transformed the attack instantly. This was no longer only violence. It was staging. Costume. Identity made physical. He was turning himself into a figure. A character. Something closer to an apparition than a man. Brian Hartnell later described how the stranger approached and claimed to be an escaped convict. He said he needed money and a car to get to Mexico. It was a story meant to create confusion, a temporary script for the victims to follow while he established control. He carried a gun. He had pre-cut lengths of clothesline. That detail mattered. It meant planning. Not impulse. Not chance. Not a sudden eruption of violence. He made Cecilia tie Brian's hands, then checked the knots and tightened them himself. He tied Cecilia as well. The whole time, he remained calm. Methodical. Almost businesslike. That quality would appear again and again in descriptions of Zodiac. He did not need to shout. He did not need chaos. His control came from the certainty that he was already dominating the moment. Then he took out a knife. The attack that followed was savage. He stabbed Brian Hartnell multiple times. Then he stabbed Cecilia Shepard even more brutally. The contrast between the stillness of the afternoon and the violence of what happened next stayed with investigators and the public alike. A lakeside setting in broad daylight should have felt safe. It should have felt too open for something so intimate and vicious. But the Zodiac had already shown a willingness to adapt. He was not trapped by one method, one weapon, or one kind of scene. That flexibility made him harder to predict. After the stabbings, he walked back up the hill toward Brian's car. There, using a black marker, he wrote a message on the door. The dates of the earlier attacks. The location names. And beneath them, the current date. Then he added the cross-circle symbol. It was one of the coldest moments in the case because it showed what the Zodiac thought of the crime he had just committed. He was cataloging it. Not escaping from it in panic, not fleeing blindly, but pausing to place it into a sequence only he fully controlled. He was writing his own continuity, turning separate acts of violence into one connected narrative. Brian Hartnell survived. Cecilia Shepard did not. She lived long enough to speak with investigators, but the wounds were too severe. She died 2 days later. For police, the Lake Berryessa attack was both horrifying and significant. Survivors meant testimony. The costume meant symbolism made visible. The writing on the car door meant certainty. The killer was not only claiming responsibility after the fact anymore. He was signing the scene itself. And then, once again, he called the police. A man phoned the Napa County Sheriff's Office from a payphone and reported the crime. As before, the voice was calm. Controlled. Detached. He gave the location and identified himself in the same indirect way the Zodiac had begun using in letters and calls. The pattern was unmistakable now. Attack. Communication. Control. Violence alone was not enough for him. He needed the second act. The call. The letter. The message. That was where the crime became complete in his mind. By this point, investigators across multiple jurisdictions were trying to coordinate a case that was becoming more complicated every month. Vallejo police, Napa County authorities, San Francisco investigators, and journalists were all dealing with the same growing problem from different angles. Each new attack brought more evidence, but it also brought more noise. More theories. More public fear. More pressure. And before they could regain control of the case, the Zodiac escalated once again. October 11, 1969. San Francisco. Until then, many people had still imagined the Zodiac as a predator of secluded places. Dark roads. Lovers' lanes. Quiet lake areas where couples were alone and help was far away. There was terror in that image, but there was also a kind of boundary. If people avoided isolated places, maybe they could avoid the danger. Paul Stine's murder destroyed that illusion. Paul Stine was a 29-year-old taxi driver. That night, he picked up a passenger in San Francisco. The destination brought them into the Presidio Heights neighborhood, a quiet residential area that looked worlds away from the lonely roads and lakesides already linked to the Zodiac. There, inside the taxi, the passenger shot Stine in the head. But the killing did not end with the shot. The murderer then took a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt before leaving the cab. That detail would become one of the most important in the entire case because it transformed later letters from probable confessions into undeniable proof. Only the killer could have mailed pieces of the victim's shirt. Only the killer could use them as a private signature. Even more striking was what happened after the shooting. Witnesses saw the man. For a brief moment, the Zodiac was not a shadow on a road or a figure behind a flashlight. He was visible in a city neighborhood. A white male adult, moving away from the scene with apparent composure. Police dispatchers initially sent out an incorrect description that referred to the suspect as a black male adult, a mistake that would later be examined with frustration because it may have helped Zodiac slip away during one of the closest moments police ever had to catching him. Officers were in the area. Close. Possibly close enough to stop him if the information had been correct from the beginning. Instead, the killer vanished again. And in cases like this, near captures often become their own kind of wound. Investigators replay them in their minds. The public hears about them and imagines how different everything might have been if one description had been accurate, if one patrol car had turned the right way, if one officer had looked twice at the man walking away into the night. But history is built from exactly those missed seconds. For the Zodiac, the murder of Paul Stine marked another shift. This was no longer just a series of attacks on young couples. Now he had killed a working man in the middle of a city. A taxi driver? An adult with no romantic context, no lover's lane, no picnic blanket by the lake. The pattern had widened again. That made him even more difficult to understand and therefore even more frightening. Soon afterward, letters arrived to confirm what many already suspected. The Zodiac wrote to newspapers claiming responsibility for Paul Stine's murder and enclosed pieces of the shirt as proof. There was no longer room for reasonable doubt. The writer of the letters and the killer were the same person. The mythology and the physical crimes had merged completely. And with that confirmation, the Zodiac gained something killers often seek but rarely achieve to this extent: authority over attention. He could command headlines. He could redirect public conversation. He could make police and journalists respond to him instead of the other way around. That kind of power is intoxicating, especially to someone who appears to have built his entire identity around the idea of being unknowable. The more the case expanded, the more contradictory the Zodiac seemed. He was theatrical, but disciplined. He was impulsive enough to keep changing his methods, yet careful enough to preserve his distance. He seemed hungry for visibility, but he never truly stepped into the light. He wanted to be recognized as a force without being recognized as a person. And the public responded exactly the way a killer like that hopes they will. People obsessed. Every letter became an event. Every symbol printed in a newspaper became part of the larger myth. Amateur sleuths studied ciphers at kitchen tables. Radio hosts speculated about hidden meanings. Police lines were flooded with tips. Some sounded plausible. Most were useless. Men who looked strange. Neighbors who acted oddly. Former classmates remembered as quiet or angry. Names came and went. The file grew larger. The certainty did not. The case was becoming one of the defining fears of California. Not because the Zodiac killed more people than other murderers, but because he understood performance. He understood that a killer who writes, threatens, boasts, and leaves symbols behind can occupy more space in the public imagination than a killer who simply disappears after each attack. He was not only creating victims. He was creating an atmosphere. And by late 1969, that atmosphere had spread far beyond the crime scenes themselves. Parents worried when their children stayed out late. Young couples thought twice before parking on remote roads. Taxi drivers looked more carefully in the rearview mirror. Police departments were forced into a constant state of reaction. The Zodiac was not everywhere. But it was beginning to feel as if he could be. That is how fear matures. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until ordinary life begins adjusting itself around one unseen person. And the most dangerous part was that the Zodiac seemed to understand exactly how to keep that process alive. He knew that every attack had to be followed by a message. Every message had to deepen the mystery. Every mystery had to make him look larger than he really was. Because the truth beneath it all was still the same. He was one man. One man with weapons, a car, a pen, and a need for control. But as long as no one could name him, that was enough to make him feel enormous. By the beginning of 1970, the Zodiac was no longer just a criminal investigation. He had become a constant presence. Not visible. Not identifiable. But always there. That is the stage where cases like this become something larger than law enforcement can easily contain. The crimes are real, the victims are real, but the fear begins to operate independently of both. It spreads through imagination, through repetition, through the simple fact that no one can point to a face and say, "That is him." The Zodiac understood that space better than anyone. And he continued to use it. The letters kept coming. Each one slightly different in tone, but all carrying the same underlying message. Control. Mockery. Superiority. He wrote to newspapers as if he were part of the editorial process. He corrected details. He criticized police. He demanded attention. In one letter, he complained that his symbol was not being printed correctly. That detail, small as it seems, revealed something important. He cared about presentation. He cared about how he was perceived. The symbol was not just a mark. It was branding. And he wanted it to be recognized. That instinct separated him from many other killers. He was not satisfied with anonymity alone. He wanted a consistent identity, something that could travel from one article to another, from one conversation to the next. The cross-circle symbol became that identity. Simple enough to remember. Distinct enough to stand out. Easy to reproduce. Easy to fear. At the same time, the ciphers continued. Some were partially solved. Others resisted every attempt. The unsolved ones became their own kind of psychological pressure. People believed the answers were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to unlock them. That belief kept attention fixed on the case long after any single attack would normally fade from memory. The Zodiac was not just committing crimes. He was creating puzzles. And puzzles keep people engaged. But while the public focused on symbols and codes, investigators were trying to build something more practical. A suspect. A location. A pattern that could be followed to a real person. That work was slower. Less dramatic. And far more frustrating. Because every lead seemed to dissolve under pressure. Tips flooded in daily. Thousands of names. Thousands of possibilities. Most were based on coincidence. Someone who owned a similar gun. Someone who lived near a crime scene. Someone who behaved strangely. Someone who once said something unsettling. Each had to be checked. Each consumed time. And almost all of them led nowhere. That is one of the hidden realities of large investigations. The more famous a case becomes, the more noise surrounds it. And noise can bury the truth as effectively as silence. The Zodiac benefited from that. He did not need to be invisible in a perfect sense. He only needed to be one possibility among thousands. Meanwhile, his communication grew more unpredictable. Some letters contained threats about bombs. He described devices he claimed to have planted. He included diagrams, instructions, details that suggested a level of planning that went beyond the earlier attacks. Police took those threats seriously. They had no choice. Even if the bombs did not exist, the possibility that they might exist forced authorities to divert attention, resources, and time. That is another form of control. A single person, through letters alone, can reshape how an entire system operates. The Zodiac was learning how to do exactly that. He began referencing the media coverage directly. He commented on how newspapers reported his actions. He reacted to what was being said about him. That feedback loop was important. It meant the case was no longer one-directional. It was a conversation. A dangerous one. Because every response from police or press risked encouraging him further. The attention he received became part of the reward. And reward tends to reinforce behavior. At the same time, something else began to change. The frequency of confirmed attacks slowed. That shift created a different kind of tension. When a killer is active, people fear the next incident. When a killer becomes quiet, people begin asking a different question. Is he gone? Or is he waiting? Silence can be more unsettling than violence. Because it removes even the limited sense of pattern people try to build for themselves. With the Zodiac, silence never meant absence. The letters continued. And each letter was a reminder that he was still out there, still thinking, still observing, still capable of returning at any moment. In April 1970, one of the most well-known letters arrived. In it, the Zodiac claimed responsibility for earlier crimes and hinted at future ones. He also included part of Paul Stein's shirt again, reinforcing his credibility. That detail continued to anchor the mythology to reality. No matter how strange the tone of the letters became, there was always that piece of physical evidence tying everything back to a real act of violence. He also began expanding his narrative. He spoke about collecting victims, about an afterlife, about a purpose that went beyond ordinary explanation. Whether he believed these ideas or simply used them as tools is something investigators debated then and still debate now. But from a strategic perspective, the effect was clear. The more abstract his motives appeared, the harder it became for people to place him inside a familiar psychological category. And when people cannot categorize something, they tend to fear it more. The investigation, however, remained grounded. Detectives continued comparing evidence across jurisdictions. They studied handwriting. They analyzed linguistic patterns. They tried to identify common threads in the attacks. But the Zodiac had already complicated those efforts by changing his methods. Different weapons. Different locations. Different times. He refused to stay consistent long enough to be easily tracked. That inconsistency was not chaos. It was protection. And it worked. As the months moved forward, the case entered a strange phase. It was still active. Still discussed. Still unresolved. But it no longer had the same clear forward momentum. There was no single breakthrough. No moment where everything suddenly aligned. Instead, there was accumulation. More letters. More theories. More speculation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the case began to shift from immediate crisis to enduring mystery. That transition is subtle. It happens when the present stops providing new answers and the past becomes the primary source of information. For the Zodiac, that transition did not mean he had been forgotten. Far from it. It meant he had embedded himself in something more permanent. A story that would not easily end. Investigators still believed he could be caught. They followed leads. They revisited evidence. They questioned suspects. Some names appeared more promising than others. Some seemed to align with parts of the profile. But none could be definitively proven. And without proof, the case could not close. For the public, that uncertainty became part of the fascination. People continued trying to solve the ciphers. Continued comparing theories. Continued asking the same question that had existed from the beginning. Who is he? Because beneath all the letters, all the symbols, all the shifting methods, the central mystery remained unchanged. There was a man. A real man. Walking through the same world as everyone else. Possibly holding a job. Possibly speaking to neighbors. Possibly blending into ordinary life so completely that no one would ever suspect what he had done. That idea is what keeps cases like this alive. Not only the crimes themselves, but the possibility that the person responsible was never truly separate from the world around him. He was part of it. And he knew how to move through it without leaving enough behind to be stopped. By the early 1970s, the Zodiac had already achieved something rare. He had committed a series of murders. He had communicated with the public. He had shaped his own identity. And he had avoided capture. But the story was not over. Because even when a killer stops, the question of who he is does not disappear. It waits. In files. In evidence. In unanswered codes. Waiting for someone to finally see what everyone else missed. By the time the Zodiac's letters began to slow, the damage had already been done. Not only to the victims, but to the way people understood safety. Because cases like this do not end cleanly. There is no moment where everything resolves. No single arrest that pulls the fear out of the past and locks it away. Instead, there is something more complicated. The violence stops. The voice fades. But the questions remain. In the years that followed, investigators continued working the case. They revisited evidence. Compared fingerprints. Analyzed handwriting again and again. Each time hoping that something overlooked before might suddenly make sense. A partial print. A fragment of DNA. A pattern hidden in plain sight. Suspects came and went. Some seemed convincing at first. They matched parts of the profile. They lived in the right areas. They had the right kind of background. The right kind of isolation. The right kind of anger. But none of it was enough. Because in a case like this, close is meaningless. Either you can prove it, or you cannot. And the Zodiac remained just outside that line. There were moments when it felt like the answer was near. Moments when investigators believed they were one step away. A suspect whose name kept returning. A connection that almost held. A piece of evidence that almost aligned. But almost does not solve a case. Over time, something began to change. Not in the evidence, but in how the case lived in the world. The Zodiac was no longer just a current threat. He became something else. A mystery. His name moved out of police briefings and into books. Into documentaries. Into conversations between people who had not even been alive when the crimes happened. That transition matters. Because when a case becomes a mystery instead of an active manhunt, it changes how people think about it. It becomes something to study. Something to debate. Something to try to solve from a distance. But for the families of the victims, nothing about it became distant. For them, the case never turned into a puzzle. It remained exactly what it had always been. Loss. Unanswered loss. And somewhere inside all of it, there was still a man. Not a symbol. Not a cipher. Not a name written at the bottom of a letter. A real person. Someone who had walked up to cars in the dark. Someone who had stood beside a lake in daylight wearing a hood. Someone who had sat in the back of a taxi in a quiet neighborhood and pulled a trigger. Someone who had written letters. Not just to confess, but to control. That is what separates the Zodiac from many other killers. Not only what he did, but how he made people experience it. He understood something simple. Fear travels further when it is given a voice. A voice can reach places a weapon cannot. A voice can stay long after the violence is over. And his voice arrived in envelopes. Handwritten. Carefully sent. Waiting to be opened. For a time, it worked. The letters controlled the story. They shaped the investigation. They turned a man into something larger than himself. But even that has limits. Because no matter how carefully someone builds a myth, it is still built on reality. And reality does not disappear. The evidence still exists. The files are still open. The names are still recorded. The questions are still being asked. Even now. Because the most unsettling part of the Zodiac case is not only that he was never definitively identified. It is that he was never definitively removed. There is no final moment. No confirmed ending. No clear point where the story closes. Only silence. And silence leaves space. Space for theories. For doubts. For the possibility that something important was missed. That is why the case continues. Not because of new violence, but because of the absence of an answer. Somewhere in that absence, the Zodiac still exists. Not as a man walking through California, but as a question that has never been resolved. And in cases like this, sometimes the question is the part that lasts the longest.